Naimbag nga daw kada tayo amin, I am Christian Patricio from Alianza Dagiti Pesanti Iti Cordillera or APIT TAKO, and I will be hosting this episode where we will unpack critical minerals extraction in the Philippines and examine the key free trade agreements and strategic partnerships between the Philippine and northern countries that enable this large-scale extraction and resource plunder. Kasama ko po ngayon dito, gusto ko pong i-introduce, I am honored to introduce them. Seasoned activists from the Philippines first, Ms. Angela Asuncion from Bantay Kita. Yes po. Hello po. Can you give a hi?
Hi, Christian. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be with you all today and join this incredible podcast series. My name is Angela Asuncion, and I'm a climate activist serving as Senior Advisor on Just Energy Transitions at Bantay Kita, Publish What You Pay Philippines, and Coordinator for the Asia Pacific Transition Mineral Accountability Working Group at the Resource Justice Network. And the APTMA Working Group is made up of civil society leaders across the region dedicated to strengthening human and environmental rights due diligence across the length of the green energy and technology supply chain, ensuring that mining communities at the heart of the energy transition are protected, empowered, and benefit from shared prosperity and intergenerational equity. So thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much. And also we have here is Mr. Sami Africa from IBON Foundation. Can you introduce yourself further?
Hello, everyone. Sunny Africa, Executive Director of IBON Foundation. IBON Foundation, as far as I know, is the country's oldest non-government think tank that has been supporting social movements since 1978. But I haven't been there since 1978. That's too old for me. But I think IBON's track record is from the very beginning, we've taken up issues that really affect communities, people, and the nation, but always from the perspective of the people and the planet, never profits and the interests of an elite.
Ayan, thank you very much, Pat. Super honored po ako na makasama po yung mga people from Bantay Kita and IBON Foundation. Yan po na po tayo dun sa mismong discussion natin. In the line with the so-called Northern-led transition and how trade deals and agreements are being used and weaponized to streamline the extraction and exploitation dito sa bansa natin, yung mga minerals natin. Ang question ko ay, how does the current trade system reproduce colonial patterns of extraction? Meron ba kayong pwedeng i-share kung paano yung mga extractive FTAs with the US and European Union have reshaped territorial or ecological or reproductive autonomy dito sa bansa natin? Can we please hear first from Mr. Sunny?
Oh, why start with me? I'm still getting warmed up.
Okay, baka mamaya meron si muna, si Miss Angela if meron po.
I'm happy to start as well. So
Thank you.
Of course, when we talk about the current trade system and its reproduction of colonial patterns of extraction, I want to give some background information for us in the Philippines. So the Philippines holds $1 trillion worth in untapped mineral resources, including the 5th largest nickel and 4th largest cobalt and copper reserves globally. And as the world's 2nd largest producer of nickel, second to Indonesia, nickel is crucial for lithium-ion batteries, electric vehicles, and renewable technologies. So the dominant narrative is that the Philippines plays a key role in the global energy transition. And the rising demand for transition minerals has led to predictions of 190 new mining applications within the next 4 years. And so the current trade system reproduces colonial patterns of extraction by reinforcing the colonial logic that the Philippines and other global South nations are suppliers of cheap raw materials for global North industries, while bearing the costs of ecological destruction, labor exploitation, and climate inequities. And the system of climate inequities is something that I really wanted to reinforce today because it's so prominent in the Philippines, and it is also a manifestation of green colonialism. And so I'll walk you through some of the key points. So the Philippines contributes 0.35% to global greenhouse gas emissions, yet is recognized as the #1 most climate vulnerable country in the world. And for the past decade, the Philippines has also been recognized as amongst the deadliest places in the world to be a land defender and activist, with mining being the most dangerous sector. To date, the mining sector contributes less than 1% to the nation's GDP, with mining provinces host to the highest poverty incidences. Almost half of all the transition mineral mining tenements in Mindanao overlap with both ancestral domains and key biodiversity areas. And in the Philippines, 90% of nickel is exported to China and Japan to produce Tesla's lithium-ion batteries, yet the communities extracting this nickel are amongst the poorest in the nation. And so for them, the thought of owning a Tesla is impossible, when their main focus is on everyday survival and putting food on the table for their families. And this is not a new story. We see the same climate inequities perpetuated across the Asia-Pacific region and globally. It's the continuation of colonial economic structures where raw materials leave our shores, wealth accumulates abroad, and what remains for our people is environmental destruction, displacement, and poverty. And so today's green transition is presented as a climate solution, but what we're witnessing in real time is the advent of green colonialism as we continue to operate under business as usual to meet the world's transition mineral demands. And so the minerals that power solar panels, wind turbines, and electric vehicles are coming from the same indigenous lands and vulnerable communities who already face dispossession and decades of unresolved human and environmental rights violations. So trade regimes and investment treaties are accelerating this dynamic, privileging the needs of industrialized global North economies over the rights and futures of frontline peoples in the global South. And I have a few examples as well that's mentioned. The first is last July, the US amended the US-Philippines Partnership Act of 2024. And this bill states that the Secretary of State shall seek to enter negotiations with the Philippines for an executive agreement relating to critical minerals that requires that duties not be imposed on the export of minerals. And the bill also states that the US will provide support to mining and fossil fuel projects in the Philippines. And so there's major risks that are identified within these provisions. The first is that by requiring that no duties be imposed on the export of critical minerals, the agreement risks prioritizing the needs of the US over the economic benefits of the Philippines. And this could lead to a scenario where the Philippines continues to not receive adequate financial compensation for its valuable resources and exacerbating economic disparities. And the provisions can also be interpreted as a way to align the Philippines' trade policies with US interests. I also wanted to highlight one key point as well, that geopolitical tensions for transition minerals also pose significant risk of deepening inequalities and fueling ongoing exploitation and violence for host communities. So trade agreements such as the EU Critical Raw Materials Act reveal that these minerals are not only being used for green technology, but also for industries such as weapons manufacturing. And this greenwashing hides a darker reality that transition minerals are being used to produce weapons of mass destruction, with minerals such as nickel being critical for the production of defense technology. And these same weapons are fueling violent conflicts and perpetuating genocides, such as within the ongoing crimes against humanity in illegally occupied Palestine. So these are just some of the ways that we're reproducing colonial violence within the so-called just energy transition.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Angela. Can you add something to the discussion, Mr. Sonny?
Wow, I'm so pressured now. I mean, Angela said everything. Okay, maybe so as not to duplicate, maybe I'll sort of take off from what Angela said and step back. I think it's super important to understand that we are in the modern era, era of AI and all these fantastic technologies. But without a doubt, despite so many technological leaps in the last decades, the current trade system, it exactly, like you said, reproduces colonial patterns of extraction. And I think that's so important because from the colonial period, hundreds of years ago, until today's so-called neoliberal order or post-neoliberal, if you want that, we still have a basic situation where it's called by different names, but basically the underdeveloped, peripheral, third world, global south countries have forever, until today, been locked into a super, super simple role as a supplier of raw materials, mineral and agricultural commodities, and cheap labor, and markets and dumping grounds for the surpluses of the imperial powers, global north, colonial powers. I think that's so important to grasp because sometimes you really see how big a problem is if it's lasted for so long. And there's a tendency, language changes, people sort of come up with new terms, new terminology. But I think fundamentally, what we have right now in 2025, and will have for some time, unless we have our uprisings and revolutions, we have basically the exact same colonial model where wealth is extracted from the underdeveloped third world global south countries in the form of our most brazenly our raw materials, our resources, but also I think in terms of our cheap labor. At the same time, they suck out wealth from us, and we're also denied the capacity to develop ourselves, especially in terms of industrialization. I think that's so important to grasp because um, for about 40 years now, haven't been born, that haven't been alive that whole time. For about 40 years now, we've been told that, okay, guys, just globalize, embrace this multilateral system, this fantastic world order, molded around the World Trade Organization in 1994, and then, like thousands of free trade agreements worldwide since the 1990s. We were told, okay, this is it. This is how you progress. Open up your economies. Things are going to be great. Well, 40, 50 years later, things actually aren't that great. And I think that's a good takeoff point for the current discussion because where we are right now, it's not always the simple use of force, territorial control, by how the global north extracts our wealth and our resources. They're much more civilized now. You have people in suits, in business dresses, doing their nice meetings in sort of air-conditioned rooms and offices. But basically, the whole multilateral system has actually worked to reproduce the exact same asymmetry since colonial times from hundreds of years ago. And I think that's a good takeoff point because that's also where our opening is. I mean, right now, I think most of your listeners probably will have been born, grown up in a world where it was given. The rules are open trade, market access, investor protections, intellectual property rights. At the same time, the poor countries have said, you guys are poor because you haven't opened up enough. You guys are poor because you have such shitty governments implementing these really bad policies that actually hinder development. So they've actually foreclosed development for us. And it's so self-serving. By foreclosing industrial development for our countries, they've suddenly freed up our resources, our cheap labor for their profits. And I think, in effect, what we're seeing right now, it's jazzed up so much more. It looks so much more modern. In a lot of ways, very civilized, except for the very fringes where you have outright violence, displacement, and attacks on communities. We still have, in effect, colonial extraction minus a colonial flag. Surpluses are still sucked to the north, while all the risks, like Angela said, all the environmental costs and social dislocation remain local. And I think the Philippines is such a good example of that because we've been opened up for so long. We started open up actually in the 1960s. Most countries opened up in Southeast Asia. Most of them started opening up in the late 1970s, 1980s. Philippines, world leader in that regard. We started opening in the mid 1960s. Since then, what the North has been getting from us, especially the United States, European countries, and Japan, what they've been getting from us before is exactly what they're getting from us now. Cheap labor export. When they can't export their cheap labor, they bring their investors here. Then they hire people in enclave manufacturing zones or in BPO or call centers. Again in different time zone, even in the Philippines. They set up their mining firms. By our last estimate, the Philippines may have exported about $55 to $60 billion worth of mineral exports in just the last 2 decades. That's on top of much more, maybe about $60 or $70 billion worth of agriculture and forestry exports. All the while sucking our cheap labor, sucking also our finance. We've paid about, I think, $300 billion in foreign debt since the 1980s. So it's really, sucking basically all the resources for development in the Philippines. And maybe to sort of pick up from some points Angela said, these are all very formal. We've had the WTO since 1994. We have about 12 FTAs right now. We don't have an FTA yet with the United States or with the European Union, but that's not for want of trying. But it's also because for now, they're already getting what they want, even without those FTAs. It's quite clear, for instance, when Anja talked about geopolitical rivalries, I think the most dangerous thing right now for the Philippines in terms of critical minerals is that the Philippines is going to be part of the US non-China supply chain for critical materials. And they're doing that very smartly. They're doing that with arrangements with Korea and Japan both countries of which we do have free trade agreements with. So even if we don't have a USRP FTA, the Philippine government said, oh, we don't need a USRP FTA. Let's do a bilateral minerals deal. So precluding the need for a USRP FTA with the South Korea-US FTA in place. With the Philippines-South Korea FTA in place, with the Japan-Philippines FTA in place, and then with this technical assistance from the US to make things so much smoother, we are now going to be a source for US critical minerals in that sort of triumvirate of Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. And I think that's so dangerous because that's without the USRP FTA, but the Philippines bending over backwards. And it's so crazy. The technical assistance agreement that the Philippines signed up to with the US, about $30 million, I think, in 2023. The whole point was make it easier for American firms to invest, make it easier for Filipino firms to send our minerals for processing in South Korea or Japan. Then it goes to the US in that sort of little supply chain loop benefiting the US. And maybe super last point, that's the US being so aggressive about that in the context of literally global aggression in the rest of the world. They want Greenland for its rare earth minerals. They're doing these weird deals in the Ukraine to sort of, despite the war, they want the critical minerals there. I mean, this drive for critical minerals, it's jazzed up resource plunder because, of course we want a sustainable planet. Of course we want more, renewable technologies, more environmentally friendly technologies. But it's so crazy. Plunders now, just because it's jazzed up as, oh, this is all about the green transition. Suddenly things are better. They're not. That's what I have to add.
Yes. Talagang hindi talaga siya green, no? Parang packaging talaga siya ng imperialist countries para maging katanggap-tanggap para sa mga mamamayan talaga. Mas ganun ko siya nakikita parang isa siyang marketing ploy para maging katanggap-tanggap siya sa ibang mga tao. Yung isang magandang na take note ko lang, yung isang pinaka-deadliest sa mga activist na sectors ay yung mining sector, as pointed by Miss Angela. Ramdam na ramdam yun sa amin dito sa Cordillera because the Cordillera region, as we all know, currently we have 106 mining applications in the Cordillera region. And of course, the people's movement here is very against large-scale mining. So dahil kami ay against sa mga malalaking mga companies na ito, nandun din kami sa point na natatakot din yung aming mga members, yung aming mga leaders kasi sila ay na-target sa harassment, sa mga threats, sa mga trump up charges. Tapos yung isang curious lang ako, Mr. Sunny lang din. Kasi feeling ko isa sa mga parang gusto ring tanongin ng mga tao. Kasi panahon ni Duterte, 'di ba, parang meron silang mga deals with Chinese companies, etc. Sinasabi niyo ngayon na parang hindi direct yung FTAs with US and European Union. Meron ba tayong parang ganong case na meron ba tayong mga Chinese FTAs or meron ba tayong mga indirect links with them?
Okay. It's a bit difficult now kasi na pag-usapan yung Chinese trade with the Philippines or Chinese with the US. Kasi because of the last 40 years of globalization, production supply chains have become much more fragmented and spread out. So actually right now, most of our nickel goes to China. But does that mean it's only Chinese firms that benefit from our nickel? Chances are not because if nickel from the Philippines goes to China or Japan or Australia, does it mean it's Chinese firms, Japanese firms, Australian firms benefiting ultimately from our resources? Actually, with fragmented global supply chains, guaranteed you will see American firms there at the very end. Either American firms being the end user of all the processed minerals in chips, in batteries, or whatever, but also the US as the final market for those goods. Or if not the US as the final market, a US firm selling to Europe, which is the other big market in the world today. So I think it can be a bit deceiving if you look at the raw data that, okay, most of our nickel goes to China. we have to be super, super careful. That does not mean it's China using our resources, because chances are maybe some goes to China, they process a bit, then maybe goes to South Korea, maybe goes to Taiwan, TSMC, then maybe the inputs go to an American missile or an American high technology chip or something like that. So again, the US right now is without a doubt still the world's biggest economy. The US is still the world's biggest foreign investor. By being the world's biggest foreign investor, it means they're the single country with the most national suckers of capital, based not just in the US, but based in China, in Japan, in the Philippines, in South Korea, etc., etc. So that might muddle things a bit, but actually I hope it clears things up. It doesn't mean things have changed, but because of 40 years of globalization, those accounts of Philippines trading with Korea or Philippines trading with Japan or China trading with the US, we shouldn't take them at face value anymore. We have to go to the ultimate exploiter. And still, despite the rise of China, the US does still remain the world's biggest sucker of resources and world's biggest exploiter of people's markets, resources the world over.
Yan. Gusto ko yung yung term na yun, yung soccer, kasi kapag
Suck
kapag
talaga! They just suck it. That's why they're so rich and profitable.
Yes, kasi kapag nakikita mo siya sa sa actual on the ground, makikita mo talaga parang sinasak talaga lahat ng mga dito, yung mga resources eh. From the north here in the Cordilleras, in the Cagayan Valleys, to the south, Palawan, Negros, hanggang sa Mindanao. Makikita mo talagang hinihigop niya lahat ng mga resources natin, tapos walang natitira sa atin talaga.
Tsaka yung open pit mines sa Cordy, they're so, di ba, they look so, it's just a scarring of the planet talaga, di ba? It's crazy.
Yes, super crazy nga talaga. As in, parang binubutas talaga nila yung yung mismong bundok. Ay, hindi siya parang, kasi totoong binubutas nila mismong bundok. Tapos doon na ata nila nilalagay yung straw. Tapos doon nila hinihigop. Doon nila hinihigop yung mga natin, minerals natin. Okay. Ngayon naman, now that we have contextualized yung issues natin sa kasalukuyan, maganda atang i-articulate naman natin yung yung ating resistance and build the steps forward sa ngayon. Ano sa tingin nyo yung role ng feminist or people's groups na piniplay nila? Ano yung role na piniplay nila in resisting extractivism in the Philippines? Tapos, ano yung sa tingin niyo yung itsura ng feminist or people-led approach to resource sovereignty dito sa bansa? May gusto po bang mauna?
I'll let Angela take that. It's so much more baggy for her.
Thank you. Okay, I could give it a try. So these are such great questions. Thank you, Christian. Feminist and people's movements in the Philippines have always been at the front lines of resisting extractivism. And what we know is that they've challenged both the visible violence, land grabs, militarization, criminalization of dissent, and the invisible violence, unpaid care work, displacement, and the health burdens that also disproportionately fall on women and marginalized groups. And so working with groups like Alianza Tigalmina, Bantay Kita, and many Indigenous peoples and women's organizations, groups on the ground, they've exposed how mining companies have co-opted free prior informed consent processes, used bribes and intimidation to obtain so-called consent. And feminist movements have also reframed this and fight not just as an environmental issue, but as a reproductive justice issue. So if women cannot have access to clean water, secure livelihoods, and safe environments, then their rights to health, family, and to future generations are also being violated. And what we also know is that people's groups, women's groups, have also modeled alternatives. They've pushed for community-managed renewable energy systems, circular economy practices that reduce dependence on extractivism. And they've also amplified voices in international spaces, insisting that the climate transition cannot be built on the backs of Indigenous women, fisherfolk, and farmers. And in terms of your question, what would a feminist and people-led approach to resource sovereignty look like in the communities that we work with at Bantay Kita and in the Philippines? And for me, that means centering, empowering, and safeguarding local and Indigenous communities' voices, needs, and demands in all aspects of decision-making about minerals, energy transition, and climate. And so it means economic, justice, benefit sharing. So host communities must be first in line to benefit from mining revenues through transparent royalty payments, social services, and investments in sustainable livelihoods beyond mining. One of the key priorities for us at Bantay Kita, working on the ground, is recognizing that poverty reduction and livelihood security are of the most importance, especially as we know that all of the issues that we are talking about now are only becoming intensified as they have not been resolved over decades, centuries. And so we also need to push for ecological justice. So communities must have the power to say no to destructive projects. And this has to be backed by genuine, free, prior and informed consent processes. And if consent is violated or manipulated, communities must have the right to withdraw or renegotiate agreements without fear for their safety. And reproductive and intergenerational justice. So ensuring that women, Indigenous peoples, and marginalized groups who often carry the heaviest burdens of extractivism and the climate crisis impacts are recognized as rights holders and are engaged meaningfully and empowered in decision-making processes. And then climate justice and sovereignty. So minerals extracted here should be first and foremost used to serve our people's renewable energy and energy security needs, and not simply be exported to meet the consumption demands of the North. And sovereignty means aligning resource governance with our national climate goals and not the industrial strategies of the US or EU. And lastly, restorative justice. So reparations for mining, historical mining injustices, rehabilitation of abandoned mines, debt cancellation, fair access to climate finances. Communities must be supported to restore ecosystems, reclaim livelihoods, and build futures that are not dependent on extractivism for a truly just energy transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Angela. Mr. Sunny?
I think it's so important, so important to stress how really women are in all realms of society, in politics, in the economy, always disproportionately affected. So I think even talking about our discussion about extractivist trade policies, I mean, the most brazen, I think, extraction of women and women's labor are our migration policies. You have like literally millions of domestic workers, care workers, toiling in Europe, North America, the centers of global capitalism. And that is that basically it's not slave labor per se, but it's definitely commodification of reproductive labor. It drains communities, our society, the Philippines, of social support systems while commodifying them and reinforcing global care economy chains. And I think that sort of extreme commodification of reproductive labor. That's the most obvious feature of that extractivist trade and investment policies. But having said that, I think on a daily basis, it's a bit more invisible because it happens in communities. Unfortunately, in marginal communities, rural communities, urban communities, women are invisible. But what we don't see, for instance, are when extractivist mining destroys a local ecology, destroys local food systems. It's women who have to stretch their effort, their family's resources to feed their families, or when local water resources are destroyed, by mining or plantation agriculture, it's women who will be working harder, walking further to collect water and firewood. And I think replicating that, it's not, it's there, but it's so spread out. It's not as stark as this commodification of reproductive labor in labor export, but it happens in the Philippines on such a wide scale. I think that not in the Cordillera, in the rest of the world, not the world also, but especially in the Philippines, women's groups, women participating in local organizations, community organizations, farmers organizations, they've always been on the front lines of exposing how mining, agribusiness, this infrastructure for export nonsense, how they dispossess rural communities, indigenous communities, degrade ecosystems, and in the course of that, of course, intensify their unpaid care burden. So I think that's a very prominent feature, I think, of the Philippine social movements. I think the Philippines can stand proudly to be, in the front ranks of the world in terms of women as part of grassroots communities and as women's organizations, really standing up, coming together, standing up to violence by the state, by paramilitary forces. They defend land and ancestral domains. They fight against the socio-ecological cost of all these projects. They build solidarity networks, and very, very bravely, they challenge militarization and violence. And I think that sort of resistance to extractivism, it's clearly not just an economic struggle, an economic issue. It's also, to use the feminist terminology, it is still a feminist struggle for bodily, territorial, and actually political autonomy. And I think we have to recognize that, because it's amazing that they can do that in the face of huge, huge odds and forces stacked against them.
Thank you very much for your answers po. Tama yun yung sinasabi ni Sir Sunny kanina. Marami talagang mga women leaders all around the Philippines na naging iconic in their sense na sila talaga yung pinakaunang nandyan sa nasa front line ng ating paglaban. I just remembered nung panahon ng isa sa mga first big strikes here in the Cordillera in Mangkayan, Benguet. I think merong pivotal role yung women sa take care ng mga nandun sa barikada. Sila yung nagluluto for them. Tapos hindi siya yung pagluluto, hindi siya madaling gawin kasi hindi lang yung sa mga nagbabarikada, kundi pati dun sa mismong community. It's a whole community struggle talaga. Tapos dun sa sinasabi naman ni Miss Angela kanina, yung sa profit, yung kailangan na yung profit sa mining ay dapat napupunta sa community mismo. Merong ganung indigenous na culture here in Benguet din, in Atogon, Benguet. We call it sagaok, where yung mismong mga kababaihan, pati yung mga bata din, pupunta sila dun sa mismong mines. Pinapayagan sila ng mga miners para ng mga small scale miners to, hindi to yung large scale mining. Mga small scale miners para makakuha din ng kanilang sariling gold, tas sila rin yung magpa-process ng gold sa kanila. So yun. Ang gusto ko lang tanungin kay Miss Angela, kasi I'm very much interested dun sa sinabi niya kanina about the alternatives to extractivism, katulad ng kinikwento ko. Do you have any favorite anecdote from your partners in Bantay Kita where they exhibit these alternatives? Ganyan.
Yes, thank you, Christian. One of the most amazing initiatives on the ground that I'm thinking of off the top of my head is with the communities that we work with in Surigao del Norte, the Mamanwa Manobo tribes. The women leaders there have taken us hiking through the mountains for hours every day. They hike so high and so steep to be able to get to their farms where they're farming cacao, and to see the abundance that they've created for themselves. They've also been able to start producing their own powder that they sell and redistribute across the province, and to be able to see their community-led initiatives that are grounded in what they want to pursue for their community royalty development plans, rather than what the government or what corporations tell them is best for them, is so inspiring. And to see how relentlessly they fight for the conservation and preservation of their environment, of their culture, of their community for future generations is so beautiful as well. So when I think about community-led alternatives, I think about the agroforestry and agricultural initiatives that the women are leading across Mindanao as well.
Oh, thank you very much, Miss Angela and Mr. Sunny. Thank you very much for your wonderful answers and very, very wonderful insights for this day's episode. Do you have any final words, final message to our listeners?
I'll start para Angela sa last word. Sa akin, I think inspiring is good kasi it's only among social movements, people's movements, na nakita mo talaga yung genuine empowerment ng kababaihan where they're not, alpha males in a corporation or, some nonsense na ni-replicate lang yung pagiging lalaki sa babae tas yun yung empowerment. Ako tuwan-tuwa ako kasi it's so inspiring to see a community leader na babae confronting, a soldier or a local government official or a policeman kung mostly lalaki mga yan, nakita mo no off guard sila eh. Kasi matapang na babae. And it's genuine empowerment kasi yung babae na yan, ang nilalaban niya, yung kolektibong karapatan ng komunidad niya. Including mga kababaihan doon, para maging mapagpasya, parang ginagamit ng rekurso nila, yung lupa nila, and basically controlling yung buhay nila. At maganda sa akin pala yung counterpoint, natuto yung government eh. I mean, now may mga token presence sa mga babae among the ranks of police and soldiers. Pero nakita mo, super token. So sa akin, I want to close to that image kasi yun ang pinaka-inspiring sa akin. Kung totoo mong bibigyan ng kapangyarihan yung babae, titinig talaga siya. Pero with the current system we have in the state ngayon, may mga babae dyan to soften their look. Pero kita mo, even within the ranks ng mga sunduluhan, second class sila eh. So sa akin, that's such a stark contrast with how things can be and should be, women in social movements, and how women are so tokenistic of the current system, including dun sa mga state security forces. So sa akin, tama ako, I agree with Angela, super inspiring makita yung pagtitindig na yan. Kasi I think, nandiyan na future natin, di ba? Yung paglalaban talaga yung kolektibong karapatan ng mamamayan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sunny. Ms. Angela?
Thank you so much, Sunny. That was such an amazing way to end as well. I also want to emphasize women are our past, present, and future. And to end, I want to say, as we work towards a just transformation, may we continue to relentlessly dream, reimagine, and rebuild hand in hand a liberated world for all that puts life over profit, care over extraction, and solidarity over exploitation.